So, hey, we're Tony and Beth Burwald. We've been married for almost 2 decades, so 20 years this year. We met in 2000 at work. Dated for a year, got married a year after that. We were not in church at all. When it came time to get our kids into preschool, we quickly realized we wanted a community local to Woodstock. And so our neighbors across the street were going to Bridgepoint, and they invited us, and we've been here since.
Yeah, and then as far as it goes, us meeting and working together, it was great. We had 2 incomes, and we were having a great time and got married, and then we got blessed with our Ryan, and I decided to stay home. Well, we decided that we wanted me to stay home, so we went down to 1 income, but we were still spending like we had 2, and we had a newborn. So we were quickly, obviously, spending more than he was making, and he was doing well, but it wasn't, we were trying to figure out, why are we short? What's happening here? And so that kind of started our financial journey of taking a better, deeper look into the way we were spending as a family and as a couple.
We were treating the income that we had as ours. Right, as ours. It wasn't God's, it was ours, right? Because we were making it, right? But when we really started diving in and learning God's view of money, we quickly realized that, wait a second, none of this is ours. In fact, we're just entrusted to be stewards of the money that He's provided to us. And we just decided we were going to do it. We decided it was an act of worship. It wasn't like something where we said, like, this is going to be the last thing we do. We said it's going to be the first thing we do.
When it's not easy.
Even when it wasn't easy.
When we first started, both of us didn't feel like we really had that money to give. But we did, but it was, at first, we were like, how are we going to make this happen? We had our budget, we had our tithe, we were like, we're doing this, and we were giving it, but it was fearful at first. We were like, how do we, this is scary. How are we making all this happen? But I'm telling you, God makes it happen. God blesses you in your obedience and in your worship, like Tony's saying.
And I will say, from our side, we have been far more blessed because we gave, not from a financial resources perspective, blessed in a emotional freedom, blessed in the ability to help other people, blessed in all of those things. Are far bigger blessings than we've received. So that's just, when we give, we're not writing a check and dropping it in the bucket every month. It's all automated, right? It's all automated, so we don't have to think about it, right? So just get started is all I would say, and just trust God, because He's going to come through. I've seen it again in our lives, in other people's lives, where there's been story after story, testimony after testimony, where God has provided in ways that, by the world standards, it shouldn't have happened.
Yeah.
Well, good morning. Man, wasn't that awesome to hear from Beth and Tony? Would you give it up for them and their courage just to share their story? Man, I love that each week during this series, we're highlighting not stories from me, but stories from you on how generosity has shaped and changed you guys. It's always a blessing to hear how God has used that to grow you in your walk with Jesus. A couple things before we jump in this morning, though. As many of you may have noticed, yes, there is a slight bump underneath my eye. I would love to tell you that I got in a fight with a bear and I was protecting somebody, but really I'm just clumsy. I tripped, but the good news is a chair was there to break my fall with my face, and so just wanted to address that at the beginning, so you're not thinking the whole time, does he know? Yes, I know that I have a big bump under my eye, but I didn't want to miss being here with you guys. In fact, I also don't want to miss being here with you guys tonight, because tonight is the second of our Bridgepoint summer potlucks. It'll be here at 5:30, and man, last week was absolutely amazing. The food was incredible. bowl. We had ham and cheese sliders. There was pasta salad. There was jalapeno poppers. There's so many different desserts. There was even something called sewer casserole, which sounds gross, but it tasted like heaven on earth. It was absolutely amazing. But even better than the food, we just got to spend time hanging out, and I got to talk with so many of you. You know, on Sunday mornings, we have a few minutes to talk in the lobby, but it was great just to have the evening where we could hang out and share stories and just get to know one another a little better. So you don't want to miss tonight. We have childcare for little kids. We have games for the older kids, and rumor has it there's a tug-of-war game for some of the adults, and so for all of you strong guys, I'm going to hide behind you in the tug-of-war line, but it's going to be great. And if you're thinking, man, I forgot or I didn't know, it's okay. Stop at Publix, get a charcuterie board or grab some Chips Ahoy, and just show up. It's going to be an amazing time right here tonight at 5:30. Now, this morning we are continuing in our series called The Generous Life. And the whole idea behind this series is that I believe that generosity is a marker of spiritual maturity. And we kind of framed it like this last week. When we think about how we grow, like just from a physical standpoint, where we're all born and we start off as infants, and then we become children and young adults, and then we mature into adulthood. And what we know about little kids is like they're just like the most selfish creatures on earth. Like everything is about them and what they want. It has to be done now on my timeline. But as our kids grow older, what our hope at least is that they start to shift their focus just from themselves onto the people around them. That our kids realize that they are not the center of the universe. And in the same way, Jesus says when we follow him, it's like we've been born again, and we become these spiritual infants who hopefully grow to be spiritual children, and then spiritual adults, and then one day, spiritual parents who are helping other people go on this journey of becoming more like Jesus. And in the same way that as we mature in our physical bodies and shift our focus from ourselves outward, that's what it looks like to grow spiritually as well. So see, sometimes a spiritual infant or child might say, yeah, I'll join a life group if it fits my schedule. Or I'll serve as long as I feel like it. And you're taking steps in the right direction, but it's still dictated by your wants, your needs, your preferences. And by the way, it's okay to be a spiritual infant or child. Like that's part of the maturing process. But really, what we don't want to see is that you've been following Jesus for 40 years and you're still a spiritual infant or child. Because then you're like the 40-year-old who's living in your mom's basement, kind of like living off of her. And my fear is that some of us, we're actually living off of someone else's spiritual encounters with Jesus. You're living off of someone else's faith. And the goal is that we would grow into maturity ourselves. And one of the ways that God does that is through generosity. Because when we give of our own time, when we give of our gifts and abilities, when we give of our finances, what we're doing is we're saying, I'm going to take the focus off of me and put it on other people. Like it's really important to note, like God doesn't ask us to be generous people because he needs something from us. Like God doesn't need your money. He doesn't need anything. But what he's doing is he's asking you to partner with him in your own spiritual growth and development. And so last week we talked all about generosity through giving. And so if you missed that, you can check that out on our YouTube page or on our podcast. But this week we're going to look at a different aspect of generosity. And I think it's important for us to note, I think sometimes churches, we get really bad, we don't want to say giving, and so we use generosity means giving financially. But to be a generous person, that is a whole lifestyle change that we have to make. That's a shift from not thinking about ourselves to fully thinking about other people. And so when we look at this different aspect of generosity today, I got to tell you that for me personally, this may be one of the most convicting messages I've ever prepared. Because I'll be honest with you, I don't have all of this figured out. And I'm not standing before you today as someone who's like, yeah, I'm perfect and I'm the best generous person there is and let me give you all the tips. No, I'm standing before you today as someone who's on this journey of spiritual maturity, and Jesus is still challenging me and pointing out things in my life that I need to surrender to him in order to grow in my walk with him. And so I guess what I'm asking you today, like you see my life. I'm your pastor. You see the areas where I'm doing good in, the areas I'm struggling in. I'm just telling you this is an area of growth for me. So I guess I'm not really asking you to go easy on me, but just have a little grace, and also to encourage you, like we're all in this together. So I'm just sharing with you this morning some of the things that Jesus has been challenging me with over the past few weeks and months as I've been prepping for this week. This morning, we're talking about generosity through simplicity. So I think Jesus calls us to live a life of simplicity, where we don't need all of this stuff and all of these things. And in fact, I think that this could be one of Jesus' most radical calls on our life, because we live in a culture that tells us that you don't need simplicity, you need more stuff and more things. Right? The opposite of simplicity, I would argue, is consumerism. Like keep making more so you can spend more, so you can own more. And the reality is this is not a new or recent phenomenon in our nation. In fact, as I was studying, I ran across this quote from a man named Paul Mazur from 1928. He was one of the lead investment makers from Lehman Brothers. And this is what he said, like 100 years ago. We got the quote here. He says, any community that lives on staples has relatively few wants. The community that can be trained to desire change, to want new things even before the old have been entirely consumed, yields a market to be measured more by desires than by needs. And man's desires can be developed so they will greatly overshadow his needs. I find this fascinating that 100 years ago, this guy points out that any community who can live on staples, who has their basic needs met, is going to be content. There's not going to be a whole lot of things that they want. In fact, studies consistently show that as your earning increases, so does your happiness, until your household income reaches about $70,000. And when that point happens, anything after that, any car you buy, any house you own, any stuff that you have, it doesn't add any more relative happiness to a person's life. Because once you have your needs met, you're fairly well secure and content. But what he noted is that, listen, if companies are going to sell more, they have to open up new markets. And if you're not content, what do companies have to do? They have to create discontent. And so what he said is we're shifting from an economy that targets people's needs, and now we want to target people's wants. In other words, he noted a shift, which, by the way, he said began in 1914, from a replacement culture to an upgrade culture. Like it used to be people would buy things, and only when they broke and they had reached the end of their life, then you would replace it. But we don't live in a replacement culture. We live in an upgrade culture. And we think that this is normal and this is how things are, right? Because even with our cell phone companies, what happens every 2 years? You qualify, you're eligible for an upgrade, which is really a fancy way of saying you've paid off your last loan. Now you're eligible to get a new one on the new phone. See, we're taught like our phone works and it's good. We need to upgrade it. Like our car, it still runs fine. Everything's good. But man, wouldn't it be nice to have the newer car? Man, our house, our living situation, it fits all our needs, but wouldn't it be great to have even more? And so we're in this culture that tells us that your happiness and your satisfaction will come when you upgrade and you have the latest and greatest things. So this was the culture shift that they saw happening. How did that really come to be? Well, at the same time in the 1920s, there was a man named Edward Bernays, who many people consider perhaps the single greatest influence in the world over the last 150 years, and you don't even know who he is, probably. In fact, that was by design, because he was a marketer who wanted to work behind the scenes to shift and change the very things that the American people desired. It was actually interesting, is Bernays was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. And so if you ever took a psychology class in high school or college, you probably know that Freud was the one who popularized the belief that people are not rational beings. Like when you make decisions, you might think like I'm very intellectual and I just think through things rationally. But at the end of the day, what Freud kind of conjectured is that people actually make decisions based off of their desires. And sometimes these are kind of subconscious desires that we don't even realize exist, but we're driven more by our desires for safety, for security, to be included in the group, to have kind of some mutual respect from authority, and that this is what drives us. So Bernays took this idea and he used it to market to people. And the way that he did is he didn't sell a product directly, but he tried to influence the people that influenced you. These are people of authority, people that are well respected in the community. And probably the best story, there's so many stories of the stuff that he did, but the one that fascinated me the most is how he revolutionized breakfast. You think, okay, what do you mean you revolutionized breakfast? Well, prior to 1920, do you know what the average American breakfast looked like? It was coffee or sometimes orange juice, and on occasion, some kind of biscuit or pastry. That was considered the all-American breakfast. But in the 20s, there was a company called the Beech Nut Company, and they actually approached Bernays and they said, listen, we're a food distribution company. We're sitting on mountains of bacon, which sounds delicious, by the way. They said, we cannot move this bacon. We cannot convince people to buy bacon. We'd like to hire you to help us. And so Bernays agreed. And do you know what he did? Well, I'll tell you what he didn't do. He didn't go out and get a bunch of billboards. He didn't run newspaper ads or radio ads. He didn't give like buy one, get one free coupons. No, Bernays actually went to a doctor. And he asked the doctor a simple question. Which is healthier for the average American? To have a hearty breakfast or a skimpy breakfast? The doctor said, well, if you have a hearty breakfast, you're going to have more nutrients and more calories. It's going to give you energy for the day. And so I would say the hearty breakfast is probably better. And Bernays said, great. Would you be willing to, at your own cost, reach out to other doctors to see if they concur with your assessment? The doctor agreed and reached out to 5,000 other doctors. 4,500 responded almost unanimously in agreement that a hearty breakfast was preferable over a skimpy breakfast. And so Bernays takes this information and he issues a press release that says 4,500 doctors have all unanimously agreed that a hearty breakfast like bacon and eggs is better for the American public than the standard skimpy breakfast they currently eat. And all of a sudden, newspapers pick this up as a story, and what they don't realize is it's actually an ad for bacon. The story makes headlines all over the United States, and almost instantly, bacon sales shot through the roof. In fact, the Beech Nut Company sent a letter that Bernays had framed thanking him for revolutionizing the way Americans think about breakfast. And since that time, the standard American breakfast is bacon and eggs. All because Bernays knew that people look to doctors to provide them advice on their health. And so if he could get a doctor to somehow support his product, that people would buy it. This is kind of my paraphrase of what he would later go on to say. But Bernays said, the world isn't ruled by national governments, but by invisible governments. And he wasn't talking about like some secret cabal or QAnon garbage. Okay, that's not what he's talking about. What he's saying is the stuff that actually makes the world work is that people are influenced by people they consider authorities or people in positions of respect. It's their friends, it's their family, it's celebrities, it's politicians, it's whoever. And if you can influence them, you can influence a nation. And so what these two men have really pointed out is our whole culture is designed to make you desire more. And we think that this is the way that the world should work. Except for Jesus, he knew that, listen, the more things you own, the more they end up owning you. And you can have more stuff, and you can have more money, and you can have more things. But Jesus says there's something that's even more important, and that's living a life of simplicity so that you can be generous. So here's the thing about simplicity. I think that most people here, we want to be generous. If you're here today, I think that you probably have been moved by natural disasters or things like the war in Ukraine or the refugee crises over the last few years. Maybe you see people that you know or people on social media that are going through a difficult time, and you want to be generous. You want to help. But for too many of us, we are unable to help because of the current standard of living that we maintain. You can't help because your mortgage is so high. And you've got car payments, and you've got debt and credit card bills and student loan stuff and all of this other stuff. It actually imprisons you from being the person God called you to be. And so Jesus' solution was, hey, you don't need all that stuff. All you really need is me. And so this morning, I want to look at the words of Jesus from Matthew chapter 6, and we're actually just going to allow Jesus to challenge us. I know that sometimes when we read some hard teachings of Jesus, our temptation, at least my temptation, is to try to soften the blow, say, well, Jesus didn't really mean that, or that's not really the way the world works, and we kind of try to temper what Jesus is saying. But this morning, if you'll just allow him, I think that Jesus wants to challenge us. And I know one of the first things we'll think of is like, you know what, Jesus is teaching about rich people. but I'm not rich. Like nobody thinks they're rich. But on a global scale, like you are in the top few percentile of the wealthiest people in the world. It doesn't always feel like it because there's always wealthier people around us. But as far as Jesus is concerned, our basic needs are met. Like most of us aren't worried about where our next meal is coming from. In fact, most of us have been blessed so much that we're going to bring food to share with other people tonight. You're not worried about those basic necessities, and you even have extra. So Jesus would look at us and say, no, you are rich. And so what does Jesus say to those of us who are in our current situation? So we're going to pick up in Matthew chapter 6, starting in verse 19. Jesus says, "Don't store up for yourself treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourself treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves don't break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Jesus starts his teaching on finance, and he says, do not store up treasures for yourself on earth. And this wasn't written in English, it's written in Greek, and the word for treasures there could be translated as valuables, or probably best translated as wealth. Do not store up wealth for yourselves on earth. Like, let that sink in. Because what Jesus says here, like that comes in direct conflict with the message we are told from day one, which is the goal in your life should be to build up enough wealth and enough assets so that you can live comfortably and you don't have to worry about a thing. And Jesus says, do not store up wealth. I think we really have to wrestle with that, because sometimes this is so counter to the way our world works that sometimes we even Christianize storing up wealth for ourselves. Tony and Beth talked about this even in their video. Like sometimes we think, well, we'll just give 10% and we'll pay off our debt and then the rest is up to us and we can do whatever we want with. But Jesus says, no, because sometimes what you do with the rest of it actually imprisons you, and your goal should not be to store up wealth. If the goal of your life is to store up wealth, that is an anti-Jesus goal. Like another way we could say it is that is an anti-Christ mindset, to make the goal of your life to store up wealth and assets for yourself. Now, Jesus is talking about storing stuff up, and it reminds me of another story that Jesus told in Luke chapter 12. At this particular point in Jesus' ministry, this man approaches Jesus and says, Jesus, we need you to settle this dispute. My brother and I are arguing over inheritance and who gets what. Will you help us figure this out? And Jesus says, why on earth would I be the judge in this matter? And he actually goes on further to say, this is a stupid thing for you to be arguing about. Who cares? Like, who gets what part of the inheritance? And to illustrate his point and underscore it, Jesus tells a story in Luke chapter 12, starting in verse 16. Jesus told them a parable, said, a rich man's land was very productive. Let's stop here for just a moment. All right, he starts off by saying, a rich man. Okay, this could be any rich person. He doesn't say there was someone from Galilee or from Judea. No. This is a generic rich person. And really the definition of rich here is that he has his basic needs met and he probably has a little bit left over. And so the idea that this person is generic, and when Jesus tells this parable, he wants us to put ourselves in the position of the rich man. Are we tracking so far? Yes, no, maybe? All right, now it says there was a rich man, and what was very productive? What does it say? The land was very productive. It doesn't say that this man was very productive. It doesn't say he was really hardworking and he was really shrewd in his business dealings and he hired the right people and he built this whole empire. He pulled himself up by his bootstraps. No, it says the land was productive. Now, think about from a first century Jewish person's perspective. If the land is producing something, then who is really producing something? God, right? That's always the answer, right? It's God or Jesus when you ask a question. Right, it's God. I feel like every week now, this has turned into my therapy session where I'm kind of like updating you on my gardening experience. But one thing that I am learning in my little knowledge is that for some reason, I cannot grow tomatoes. They're not working. And man, you can do everything right. Like you can put the fertilizer in, you can water it, you can care for it, you can get the pests away. but I still am dependent on the sun and on the rain to do their thing and not to overwater, not to underwater. Like there's all of this stuff. And so I really understand, well, I don't really understand, but I'm starting to understand that if you want to harvest, you're depending on God a whole lot. Like you do a lot of work, but ultimately it's God who brings the harvest. It's God who brings the blessing. But like, do we approach our lives this way? Do you realize like it's the land that's producing? It's God that blessed this man. It wasn't you who landed that account. It was God who blessed you. It wasn't you who's provided for the family. It was God who blessed you. It wasn't you who pulled yourself up. No one is a self-made person. We are people who've been blessed by God. And here's the thing. It's God blessed this man. It didn't say he was a horrible person or that he was rude or malicious or underhanded business practice. No, this is a man who was blessed by God. It's not that he did anything to earn it, but God blessed him. But it's what he did with the blessing that Jesus wants us to pay attention to. In the very next verse, it says, he thought to himself, what should I do since I don't have anywhere to store my crops? I will do this, he said. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones and store all my grain and my goods there. Then I'll say to myself, you have many goods stored up for many years. Take it easy, eat, drink, and enjoy yourself. So this man has a problem because he's been blessed by God. Why is that a problem? Well, because all of his storehouses, all of his barns are already full. So what am I supposed to do with all of this blessing that God has given me? And he says, you know what I need to do? I need to build bigger barns and more storehouses so I can keep all of this, and then I'm going to be set for years, and I can just kick back, relax, eat, drink, and be merry. That sounds like, for a lot of us, like that's our retirement plan right there. No, it's not. I think Jesus is all for prudent planning, but this man already had everything he needed and more. His barns were already full. And then God blessed him even more, and instead of sharing the blessing, he keeps it for himself. And God has something to say about that. In verse 20, it says, God said to him, you fool, this very night your life is demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? That's how it is with the one who, remember the phrase, stores up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God. See, God said, listen, you can save all this up, but at the end of your life, all of that's going to rot in the barn. It goes nowhere and it does nothing. This is what it looks like when we keep everything to ourselves instead of being rich towards God. See, storing up treasures for ourselves, storing up wealth for ourselves, that's a very self-focused thing to do. But what does Jesus say? He said, actually, store up treasures for yourself in heaven. And, growing up, I always thought, okay, well, you go to heaven when you die, and so you do good things here on the earth, and then, you get a crown, and then there's jewels in it, and all this other stuff. But remember, when Jesus talked about heaven, he wasn't talking about dying and going to heaven. What was he talking about? He's talking about bringing heaven to earth. And the whole point that Jesus is making is don't hoard your wealth for yourself, but you should use it to bless the people around you. That's what heaven on earth looks like. Everyone's needs are being met. So instead of building bigger barns, build longer tables so you can feed more people. Instead of consuming everything yourself, contribute to other people. Instead of being self-focused and getting more and more and more, we ought to be giving more and more away. This was actually always God's plan. Like when you look at the Old Testament, God gives commands to the nation of Israel. And remember, Israel is supposed to show the world what heaven on earth looks like. So sometimes we approach the Bible like it's this rule book, like just a bunch of do's and don'ts, and that God wants us to be good moral people. That is not at all why God gives his commands. He's not trying to give you rules to be good moral people. He's trying to show you what heaven on earth looks like. And if you actually look at the economic policy in the Old Testament, it reads more like a page out of Bernie Sanders' book than a capitalism textbook. I mean, there's some radical things. Because in the Old Testament, they did not believe in personal property rights. They did not believe people owned land. Because who owned the land really? God, right? Remember I said every answer is always God or Jesus, right? So God owned the land. And God divvied up the land to all the different families in Israel. Now, yes, of course, over time, maybe there was a harvest that didn't happen, or there was a famine, there's some economic struggles. So people would sell their land to other people in Israel. Sometimes they would even enter into indentured servitude to pay off their debts. But what the Old Testament actually prescribes, every 49 or 50 years, there was something called the year of Jubilee, where all the land went back to its original owner, all the slaves were set free, and all the wealth was redistributed throughout the nation. I mean, can you imagine if we had that policy like go through the House and the Senate today? There'd be people up and what do you mean? We can't give people back land they sold. These people are paying off their debt. We can't forgive their debt. Redistribute wealth. I mean, this is absolutely radical. But the whole point is that when heaven comes to earth, everyone's needs are met. And by the way, Jesus isn't going to do that through some kind of government policy or political party, but the church is supposed to be heaven on earth. And the church is a place that if you come here, you're supposed to have your needs met. But sometimes your needs are met by you, and your needs are met by you, and their needs are met by you, and we all share in this together. But if we're all focused only on our own wealth, how can we bring heaven to earth? Jesus says, where your treasure is, that's where your heart will be. And for many of us, our treasure is all in ourselves. And so our heart remains focused on ourselves. But if we dare to follow Jesus, he calls us to shift our heart to be focused on Jesus and his kingdom and serving him and bringing heaven to earth. Does this make sense? Are we tracking? Yes, no, maybe? Now, we talk about living a life of simplicity. What does that mean? I love the way Richard Foster defined it. He said, simplicity is an inward reality with an outward expression. It's an inward reality. It's something that starts in our heart, but then has an outward expression. And by the way, I think it's so important to hold both of those things in tension. Because if you have the inward reality, but you don't have the outward expression, then guess what? You don't actually have the inward reality. Like if I say that I love my wife, but I'm not faithful to her, do I really love my wife? Or at least am I being loving of my wife? Absolutely not. So you have to have the inward reality, and it has to manifest itself in the outward expression. But if you have the outward expression without the inward reality, it becomes legalism. And by the way, legalism always leads to judgmentalism. Because then you say, oh, well, I've sold all my stuff. I'm living a simple life, but did you see the car they just bought? Did you see the shoes he was wearing? Can you believe they spent money on that? And see, we can do all the outward things, but it starts with an inward transformation. By the way, I think it shows up in kind of two primary false gospels in the way we talk about finances. One of those is the prosperity gospel. And in the prosperity gospel, what we oftentimes hear is that, you know what, if you love God and you pursue him, then he's going to bless you. You're going to be healthy. You're going to have a lot of money. You're going to have a lot of wisdom. I mean, I've even heard pastors say before, like, you know what, I want my kids to have good clothes, and God wants you to have good clothes too. So if you don't have good clothes, you just need to serve more and get God's blessing. Now, the problem with that, there's a lot of them, but the big problem is that gospel turns God into a cosmic vending machine. Like if I just give, if I just serve, if I just show up at church, then I'm going to get the blessing out from God. And so what we try to do is we live our lives trying to manipulate God for a blessing. Now the reaction of that then kind of shifts over the other direction into something we could call the poverty gospel. And this is where, you think, okay, I'm going to sell all my possessions and move across the country. And you know what? God might ask you to do that. But sometimes what we do is, you know what, I'm going to cut out all these things, and I'm going to live a really simple lifestyle, and then God's going to bless me. And then do you see how it's the same thing, just on the opposite end? Like we say, okay, well, I'm going to sell all my stuff, and I'm going to live a life of simplicity, and I'm not going to give in to these things, and then God will be happy, and then God will love me, and then God will bless me. It's the same vending machine manipulation of God. And listen, Jesus calls us to none of that. But he does call us into a relationship with him and a lifestyle of simplicity. Think about that inward reality. Look at the very next verses Jesus says in Matthew chapter 6, verse 22. He says, the eye is the lamp of the body. And if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. So if the light within you is darkness, how deep is that darkness? It seems like a weird turn. Jesus is talking about not storing up treasures, and now he's talking about a good eye and a bad eye and light and darkness. What on earth is he talking about? He's talking about where's your focus on? Are you looking towards the kingdom of light? Are you looking to build Jesus and bring heaven to earth? Or are you looking to build your own kingdom? Like that's the inward reality that has to change. We have to allow the light of Jesus to illuminate the way we see the world. The world is no longer like up there for our taking, and it's no longer something that we use to fulfill our own desires, but we look at the world as a place to serve and to love, to be the hands and feet of Jesus. Now, how do we shape this inward reality? I think there's 3 things that help shape it. They're all, none of these are going to be new to you. First one is, I think, like just spend time with Jesus. Right? Like what does Jesus say when he teaches? Jesus is a brilliant teacher, and when he teaches, he's not always trying to convince people. He just tells people how the world is, right? He's just painting the picture. This is how God intended the world to be, and you're invited to join that. You're invited to be a part of that. Now, I'll be honest with you. Sometimes, though, I read teachings of Jesus like this, and I'm like, is that really good, though? Like, is that really right? Like, what am I going to be missing out on if I follow this teaching of Jesus? But see, the more time we spend with him, we can say, well, I can trust him over here because he's been right here, and he's been right here, and he's been right here, and he's been right here. And so even if maybe I'm not fully there yet, I think I can go ahead and trust him here because I've been able to trust him with everything else. I think our inward reality also changes. We have a community of people around us who's helping us pursue a lifestyle of simplicity. Because for many of us, it's like the people around us, they start to, get all this new stuff, and then we want to. It's back to that whole Edward Bernays thing. We're influenced by the people around us. What if instead of surrounding yourself with people who have given themselves fully over to consumerism, what if there was a group of people committed to a simplistic lifestyle who held each other accountable for that? Where we saw the benefits of living with simplicity. Where you even had people speak into our lives and say, I don't know if that's the best purchase. Are you sure you've prayed about that? People hold us accountable. But the third thing that shapes our inward reality, and this is going to sound a little strange at first, but it is that outward expression. See, it doesn't start with the inward reality and just manifest itself as an outward expression. They both reinforce each other. Because that's like Tony and Beth talked about. When they first started giving, it wasn't like they were like, oh boy, I'm excited. Let me just give. It was something that they did because they wanted to be obedient. But the more they were obedient, the more they began to love being a people who are generous. Does that make sense? And so they kind of feed off of each other. But what does that outward expression look like? Verse 24, Jesus says, no one can serve 2 masters, since either he will hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. It says you can't serve 2 masters. You're going to love one and hate the other. I read this verse and I wrestle with it because I'm like, well, I don't hate God. So certainly this doesn't apply to me. But when he rephrases that and says you'll be devoted to one and despise the other, to me, that's where the rubber hits the road. So are you more devoted to building your kingdom or building God's kingdom? Are you more devoted to yourself or to other people? Where does our devotion lie? And actually, when Jesus says money, the word he uses is mammon. That's a word we don't use a whole lot. Remember, Jesus was a first century Jewish man speaking to first century Jewish people. They knew mammon well because first century Jewish people believed there were powers and spirits at work in the world, and one of those was mammon. Mammon wasn't just money, because money is a neutral thing, but they believed that the power of mammon came in and was a desire for more. Like, let me just get a little bit more. It's like that famous question, how much is enough? Just a little bit more. It's always just a little bit more. We actually see the spirit of mammon at work in the Old Testament. When Solomon had turned his back on God, you know how the author lets the reader know? They said he amassed 666 tons of gold. 666. There was something evil about him amassing that much wealth. He actually bought war horses and chariots from Egypt, which, remember, is where Israel was enslaved. And they're supposed to be moving forward, and now Solomon, in his quest for power, is moving them back towards slavery and enslavement again. See, we have to have this outward expression of a simplistic lifestyle. You say, Matt, all that theory, just give me practical things. What does it look like to live a simplistic lifestyle? Because Jesus doesn't tell us how much we're allowed to make or how much we're allowed to spend on clothes or how much of a grocery budget is too much. He just doesn't go there. He does address the heart, and he's going to trust that the Holy Spirit is going to work that stuff out. But at least for me, there's a few things that I have found helpful as I'm wrestling through what does simplicity look like for me. The first one is this: buy stuff for their usefulness rather than their status. Like, buy things for their usefulness rather than their status. My younger boys, they're getting really into like tennis shoes and basketball shoes now, and like they know all the different players and all their different shoes. And I'm like, really? Like, who's paying $300 for a pair of sneakers, right? Like, I mean, is that necessary? But sometimes you do it because there's a status symbol associated with it. And by the way, unless we just kind of limit it to clothing, how many Apple iPhone users are here? Anybody? Don't be afraid. There we go. I'm an Apple iPhone user myself. How many of you Apple iPhone users have ever been in a group text and all of a sudden everyone's bubble turns green? Anybody ever done that? Yeah, and you're like, who added an Android user in here, right? Like, bring back the blue bubbles. And even me, like I don't want to switch to Android because guess what? I don't want to be the green bubble. I want my circle of friends and I want to be included in the in-group. There's status associated with so many things. But are we buying things for their usefulness or for their status? Do we really have to have a name brand on the clothes, or would we be shopping at Walmart, Target, Goodwill? Would those be places that we can find something that's just as useful as long as we're not worried about the status? I think another thing is we can enjoy things without owning them. Full disclosure, this is where I struggle. Because here's what happens. A friend invites me out on the boat, and I get home, and I'm researching, all right, I'm going to buy a boat. It's going to be good. And why is it that sometimes we enjoy something, and then the next thing you know, we want to own it? I think it's because it gives us control. Because if I own it, I don't have to wait to be invited out and think about all the time we would go out. And then the more I started thinking, I'm like, but really would I go out all the time? And everybody who I've ever met who owns a boat says you just be friends with someone who owns a boat. And by the way, this is not about owning a boat or not. Like, good, godly people own boats, and I am thankful for that, so I don't have to own one. But I'm talking about my own desire that when I enjoy things, all of a sudden I feel like I've got to own it. Like this is going to sound so dumb, but I had a chance to ride in a hybrid Toyota Sienna minivan, and it changed my world. I was like, I'll sell the truck. Give me the hybrid minivan. But it's like, but do I have to do that? Is it worth bringing on that much debt? My truck's paid off. It's not the most elegant thing in the world, but why do I have that desire? It's okay to enjoy things. Jesus is not telling you not to enjoy things. Enjoy creation. Enjoy the beach. Enjoy all of that stuff. But don't feel like you have to own anything. The third thing, reject anything that produces an addiction. By the way, I'm not just talking about like drugs and alcohol here. Like, I think maybe some of us here today, you're addicted to television. Like, you cannot go to sleep at night before watching something to unwind. If that's the case, then go home tonight, grab the TV off the wall, and go give it to somebody else. Like, take it to Goodwill. You think Goodwill won't take my stuff? Goodwill takes anything if you drop it off after hours, I promise you. But is it that? Is it online shopping? Like, maybe it's not realistic to get rid of your computer, but maybe there's some parameters you can put on so that you don't like comfort shop yourself. We have to reject anything that causes an addiction. Fourth thing is beware of buy now and pay later. This is how mammon gets you. Because you want this thing and you can't afford it, so I'm going to take out a loan, I'm going to just stack that debt right here, and I'm going to enjoy this, and now I'm going to be satisfied. And then a year later, you're not satisfied with that anymore, so you need something new, but you still have 4 years left on your debt. So what do? Oh, just give me a little bit more debt, and now I have this thing. And you bounce around to 4 or 5 different things. And listen, none of those things are bringing you satisfaction. They're only putting more chains on you. The Old Testament actually forbids usury, which is actually charging exorbitantly high interest rates to people. Jesus takes it further and says, if someone borrows from you, do not charge them interest. Like, every time I say that, somebody comes up after the service and asks to borrow money from me. I get it. But Jesus saying, listen, that's not who we are. But even though we don't do that, we kind of take it from the other end. And listen, I think that Jesus accommodates an imperfect world. I don't think that all debt is bad. I think debt is dangerous. You know, I think it's unrealistic unless you're just super wealthy that you paid cash for your house. And if that's you, more power to you. I think most of us are going to be in some level of debt, but don't get sucked into making impulsive decisions because you think this thing will satisfy you, and then you just strap yourself with more debt. And the last thing, by the way, this last one, this is your homework for the week. The last thing to live a life of simplicity give something away. That's your homework this week. Go throughout your house. Maybe it's something that you bought and you realize, like, I don't really ever use this, and I just keep it because whatever reason. Or maybe you have like 4 or 5 of the same thing and you don't really need all that. Or maybe there's something that is causing that addiction in your life, and you know, man, I just need to give this away so it doesn't have the power over me. Listen, every single person here, I don't care what your economic position is, we can all afford to give something away. And when we do, you'll find that your focus shifts away from you and onto others. You're going to start to notice you're looking for ways to bless other people. You're looking for ways to be generous. And that's the people he's called us to be. So in just a moment, I'm going to pray, and then we're going to have a time of communion. Because really, I feel like, you know, it's like drinking from a fire hose. Sometimes you're like, okay, I'm trying to process all this. Let's take a few minutes just to sit with Jesus. Maybe as you're grabbing communion, you want to grab one of those journals off the table. Those are free. Those are for you. Just want to jot a few things down. Maybe for you, you're already trying to think through and pray, God, what do you want me to give away? Or maybe you're wrestling with, what does this moment look like? Let me give you 2 questions to ask Jesus today. The first one is this: in what ways has consumerism inhabited me? Man, we can't move forward until we admit that maybe mammon or consumerism has its grips on my heart and in my life. Maybe it's thoughtless spending. You say you don't have a plan. You're just kind of impulsive about everything. Maybe it is the status thing. I don't know what it is, but I know that it tries to get its hands on each and every one of us. The second one is, what does simplicity look like in my life? So I'll just tell you, it's going to look like a little bit different in every family. That's why we got to be careful not to judge, well, that person wore these shoes and wore that. Our place is never to judge anybody else, but simply to ask Jesus, what does this look like for me? These are questions I've been wrestling with and praying through over the last several weeks, and I just want to invite you in on that this morning. And so what I like to do all across this room right now, would you just bow your heads and close your eyes with me? Jesus, we're thankful that you give us hard teaching. I just pray and confess right now in my own life all the ways consumerism has taken control. All the things I think I need, and in those I find happiness. And Jesus, today I just declare you are enough. You are enough. You are all I want. You are all I need. If I never have those things, that's fine, Jesus, because I just want you. Pray over each and every person here right now as they're wrestling through. Would you reveal to them ways consumerism has gripped them? Would you show them what simplicity looks like? And I pray that you would be with each of us this week. Bring to our attention things that we can give away, ways we can be generous. That's who you've called us to be. And at the end of the day, we just want to be more like you. It's in your name I pray. Amen. As you feel led, you can take communion.